Good afternoon, good evening to those joining us from Asia, and good morning to those from across Europe and into the UK. I'm Maurice Evelyn Buffson, I'm the CEO of Armstrong Wolf. Welcome to day 2 of our annual Conduct and Culture Summit, 221 Purpose Over Profit. Yesterday we had initial 7 webinars. Today we've got a further 7 and then finalising tomorrow with a triumvirate for the third 7, 21 in total. The 3 areas that we've been investigating have been, broadly speaking, around the role of leadership in relation to shaping culture and purpose, around regulation in shaping governance and actually shaping leadership, and then also in relation to tooling the executive to take the industry forward, be this technology or behavioral science or other. This morning, I'm delighted to have an enriched panel with different views, which should actually help give an enriched perspective around the dual challenge around Brexit and regulation. I'm going to do the roundtable introductions before handing to Dr. Roger Miles, who will actually lead the presentation and the questioning thereafter. So Lucy, if we could start with you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lucy de Piedad. I am the Chief Controls Officer at Barclays Bank. I look after our wholesale businesses, corporate bank, private bank, work very closely with the COO organization, the COO organization, and actually hail from that part of the business. So have a lot of interaction and work on the agenda, which our Chief Operating Office are responsible for at Barclays Bank.
Thank you very much, Lucy. John.
Thanks, Maurice, and good morning, everybody. So I'm John Liver. I lead the regulatory team at EY in London. I co-chair a thing called our Global Regulatory Network, which leads our dialogue with regulators around the world. And I've also been one of our key spokespeople and leaders on the whole Brexit topic. Delighted to be with you this morning.
Thank you, John. Christopher.
Thank you, Maurice, and hello, everyone. Chris Dickens, I'm the COO for Markets and Security Services in the EMEA region at HSBC. I also look after regulatory change globally for the markets business.
Thank you very much, Chris. Richard.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Richard Evans. I lead regulatory and compliance solutions at DXC Technology. Prior to DXC, I spent 25 years in capital markets at various global institutions, most recently as Chief Operating Officer for the equities business at Barclays.
Thank you very much, Richard. So before handing to Roger, so the structure of this session will be an outline of thoughts from Roger leading into a series of questions to the panel. We are hoping for the panel session to be enriched from questions coming from the floor. So please do pass on your questions. Gwen, our COO, will be handing those and in turn passing those to Roger. Roger, with that being said, pass the baton. The stage is yours, sir.
Maurice, thank you very much for the introduction, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone around the world who's joining us. What a privilege to host this session with such a great panel and also some great material to discuss. Now, I'm going to confess straight away that although I am a regulatory analyst, my specialist subject is conduct regulation and culture assessment that relates to that. I will be talking about that in about 5 minutes' time, but I'm going to nod, first of all, honourably in the direction of John, who is our Brexit specialist here. And I'd like to invite John, just as we start our little agenda here, to talk a little bit about the impact of Brexit on the life of the COO. So just to spool you through how we'll cover this over the next half an hour, bit of Brexit and COO takeaways for that. I'll talk then about conduct and culture, direction of travel, some trends to watch, and COO conclusions. And we'll then open to panel questions where hopefully we'll be bouncing around these and other related topics with our 4 colleagues on the panel before wrapping up, and I'm hoping giving you some useful takeaways for your role as a COO. So John, without further ado, over to you, please. Can I just put up a few cheeky points that I raised on Brexit, and you're welcome to run with those or other directions as you wish.
Yeah, thank you, Roger, and renewed greetings to everybody, and thanks for this. So And I think it is, Brexit is one of a number of different tipping points, I think, in financial services at the moment that lead to quite a changed environment for the industry in the UK and its position globally. So clearly, having now left the EU, the UK is now in charge entirely of its own regulatory direction of travel. And we've seen response to that from the Chancellor and indeed from a number of the senior regulators over the last few months, with a whole raft of different reviews of the UK regulatory regime, all designed to really to enhance the competitiveness of UK financial services, but also to take forward some of the new trends that are going to dominate the industry over coming years. So we've seen the listings review by Lord Hill, Ron Khalifa's fintech review, both issuing their reports really very quickly already in the first quarter of the year. There's a whole debate around the future of regulation. Nikhil Rathi, the FCA CEO, is speaking at the International FinTech Conference this week, talking about innovation and the importance of the regulator's role, both in facilitating that, but being clearly conscious and aware and alert to the risks involved as well, and helping innovative companies to go from sandbox to what is calling scale box, or to a regulatory nursery, to build up the possibilities and the environment for more innovative financial propositions and products in the market. So really quite a different environment, I think, that the industry faces now from the post-2008 environment. Very heavy focus on, making the industry safer, making sure that people's capital and liquidity and risk management were all strongly, strengthened, and that some of the scandals that happened with LIBOR, etc., were not repeated. So a real kind of implementation and reaction type agenda, really, for the industry for the much of the last decade is moving into much more of a forward look. What does financial services, what should it be offering to markets and to consumers and users of financial services over the next few years in a world that is changing very rapidly? And that, I think, presents quite a different mindset, both in government, and one that the industry has an opportunity to engage with in a very constructive way. What sort of future do we want to see for UK financial services? Are there areas where regulatory standards that have been put in place over the last few years are not appropriate in that world? But equally, are there new things and new risks that need to be taken account of? And the reason why I think this is important in the context of today's debate is that there is this space now which is opening up for influence by way of, yes, of course, of discussion and debate around what the industry should look like and what services should be provided and how they should be provided, but also for action. And it's very clear that governments and regulators, they don't know the answers to the next 5 years of financial services any more than we in the industry do. So they want to have the engagement, but they want to have an engagement that is clear, that it has the interests of market transparency, good market behavior, the interests of the users of financial services and consumers at its heart. And if the actions and the stance of the industry demonstrate that, then I think there's a real opportunity to have a more constructive and collaborative relationship between industry and regulators than has perhaps been the case for the last few years. And I put that also in the context of a number of other tipping points. So Brexit is clearly one in this legislative sense. COVID is another. The financial services industry, the banking industry in particular, actually has, I think, done extraordinary things to respond to the needs of society over the past year, and can keep the taps running and providing finance to the economy, and changing their own product mix and operating processes overnight a year ago, and really an extraordinary job. And I think that has been recognised by the regulators in a way that the banking industry was clearly on the back foot in 2008-9. It's not in the same way this time. Other parts of financial services, such as insurance, I think, have other questions to answer. But for a banking industry, I think there is a there is a much stronger reputational base that we're coming out of this crisis into. And then if we look at the needs of society for the next few years and the role of financial services in that, the digital agenda clearly both as part of financial services, but more broadly, as new services, new products are developed, new tailored offerings are developed that can help consumers and businesses operate more efficiently, perhaps provide new services. The financial services industry has a massive opportunity there and responsibility to help and facilitate that transformation of the economy that is going to happen, as well, of course, as using some of those techniques, skills, etc., for its own purposes.
I think the conduct agenda, by the way, John, is sort of in step with that, which we'll come on to. This sense of being socially useful, which we hear a lot, and purpose, indeed, which is the title of this session. Yes. And
then the other big trend, I think, is clearly the green agenda, and ESG actually more broadly. And we're seeing clearly focus on social and governance as well, but the overwhelming focus from a regulatory perspective to date globally really being on the climate agenda, and clearly financial services having a massive role on that. And this year, of course, is a vital year for making progress on that space. So, and those are areas where financial services really, can be at the forefront of the changes that are coming across society, and therefore, this sense that if it is done in the way that genuinely meets the needs of your customers, your clients, and markets, and helps us to move forward at pace on those agendas, then that's a real opportunity for your businesses, for the UK, and for society more broadly. So that's why I think this, alongside a number of Brexit, alongside a number of those other tipping points, provides a real, transformational opportunity for the industry. Roger, I'll come back to you.
John, that's very, very useful framing through the Brexit lens, and I absolutely would agree with that, and also your points on the wider social purpose question, how Brexit in a curious way aligns with that. So the event of Brexit, many political analysts see as representing a broader phenomenon which we describe as vox pop risk, which is the risk that ordinary voters, we can just use that term, feel a dissatisfaction with the institutions of governance. And that could be government, it could be governance in finance, and governance in industry generally. So we're seeing, not coincidentally, the ejection of Angela Merkel, the Gilets jaunes in France, a widespread questioning of whether there's going to be a sort of post-COVID reset in society. So rather, as we had in the UK after the Second World War, that the government, which had achieved that outcome, was then thrown out in favour of a much more socialist, more redistributive, founder of the NHS kind of approach. Whether we're going to get a post-COVID moment, which will review corporate governance in similar ways. Now, clearly there are issues for COOs here. So just to touch on a few of those, my colleagues at Reuters, I was discussing this with last week, saying you've got to be very careful with Brexit and post-Brexit and indeed all other forms of governance, that what the rule book says is not always how it's enforced. And we see quite distinctive differences in enforcement style between, just to take three examples, the UK, Germany, and Ireland there. So the FCA, BaFin, and the Central Bank of Ireland, with a quite different approach to literal interpretation of the rules. And really, I just echo what John was saying, these final 2 points. The way to get involved and the way to engage is to be active. Take an interest in your industry association groups like this one. Get involved with talking to government about draft legislation, do wade in on consultations, lobby to prevent bad law, plenty of opportunity for bad law to be drafted and passed if you don't intervene. So all of that is really important. Let's now frame this in the whole conduct regime piece, which of course is another drumbeat that is running in the background. You'll see from my slightly cheesy graphic on the header slide here, we're very much now focusing not just on the mis-selling version, that's the guy with the dodgy contract, more now rebalancing towards non-financial misconduct, which in plain language is abusive behavior. So if you are working for an organization which makes its staff feel unsafe or unable to raise a reasonable question, all of that kind of thing. And the regulator is saying in those firms where there is evidence of abusive behavior, that is quite a good psychological tell for the presence of other forms of misconduct, including financial mis-selling. So we're going to talk a little bit about the evolving agenda and some techniques that regulators are using, which you may or may not be aware of. And I'll point you towards some material in a couple of minutes, which will take you into more detail if you want to read up on that. So most of this you'll be familiar with as senior managers yourselves. The regulatory remit continues to extend its powers. We've had SNCR in the UK rolling through banking, insurance, asset management, and now into other forms of solo regulated activity. Jurisdictions are spreading and regulators are talking to each other. So there are, as you may know, treaties between, for example, the UK and Japan to share their regulatory information and research, and even things like the setting of levels of fines. And this is also echoed in the other 48 jurisdictions where conduct regulation applies. Financial and non-financial misconduct I just touched on. They are much more interested now in direct observation of behavior. We'll talk about that in a second. To try and pick up on this kind of abusive workplace situation as reflective of a poor culture generally. Of course, pandemic and indeed Brexit play into this. We've been repeatedly told by regulators, Chris Woolard, Nicola Rathi, and so on, that one effect of pandemic is to give the industry collectively a new opportunity to prove its value. And they don't mean its financial dividend stream value, they mean its social purpose value. How do we as financial firms leave the world a better place? By the way, measures of morale and team cohesion are a part of this as well. And it also plays into that vox populi trust risk question that I touched on earlier. The more that you genuinely look after customers, the more that you design your reward systems around customer care rather than quantity of product sold, which most reward systems were designed to fit historically, the more you will build long-term value and, more importantly, from the regulator's point of view, public trust. So not so much building public trust as recovering or rebuilding public trust against this background of a highly skeptical general population, which of course has been deeply hurt by the event of COVID. One regulator said to me last week, imagine that COVID has created in the UK 1,000 vulnerable customers every single day of the last year, and you'll have some idea of the sort of lens that the regulator is applying to the problem. So in short, just before I give you a little more detail, where we used to judge our risks using econometric kind of hindsight measures and looking purely at financial mis-selling, very much on a quant basis, a rather kind of compliance box tick mentality, the future is much more about what behavioral scientists like me call what actually happens. So directly observed frontline behavior. Regulators in Australia and Singapore already, and in the UK next year, will be physically coming into firms or dropping into Zoom meetings to observe team interactions and to ask direct questions of frontline staff. They'll be having conversations about what actually happens. What is your experience as a salesperson of what the values mean to you? Show me a piece of work you're doing today which is putting those values into practice. So in one sense, quite straightforward, but actually quite challenging if nobody in your firm has thought along these lines before. So let me give you a quick heads up on 7 trends to watch before we throw it open to the panel. This, by the way, is just a scratch 7 trends of a much longer list, which I'd be happily to talk about for the rest of today. So the initial approach to senior managers regime was very much about defining infractions, and that was seen by compliance people as, if you like, evaluating enforcement risk. That is still there, but on top of it is being overlaid this thing about purposeful culture, meaning how do we elevate exemplary behavior? How do we show that most of our behavior, most of the time, is good, so that we're not fixating on these hopefully rare events of misconduct? The problem is the industry has missed a trick, really explaining, the goodness of most of what it does most of the time. So pro forma reporting, econometric MI, financial value at risk is now being displaced by what we're calling behavior at risk, human MI, live observation. And you may well have caught up on the announcement by the FCA a couple of weeks ago of 6 conduct questions. If you Google 6 conduct questions, hopefully on your screen, you'll find a Reuters article that I published earlier this week, explaining what the 6th conduct question is going to be. It's all about diversity, inclusion, safe spaces for hands up, psychological safety, all that stuff. So this is the direction of travel. Equally, if you had that sort of old school looking over your shoulder MI, it'll be using historic risk reporting rather than dynamic, sentient, up to the moment risk reporting, which allows you then to take a more predictive view of where the behavioral problems might lie. Of course, AI has a big role in this, and I'm looking forward to our colleagues on the panel perhaps addressing a bit of that at question time. Previously, regulators were quite isolated in local jurisdictions. As I said, there are now memoranda of understanding, treaties formally between all the major nations which are using conduct-based approaches. And that includes, just off the top of my head, yes, the USA has come back in, and Canada, the UK, obviously Ireland, Germany, France. Going further east, we can talk about Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia. You know, these are all jurisdictions where the regulator has explicitly said that they're using behavioral analysis principles in the design of the regulation. So there are increasingly these globally agreed through organizations like IOSCO and FIC, you know, I'm sure you've heard of, these sort of super groups that get regulators together and compare research and generate. So where the old style was about command and control, excuse my abbreviations, the new style is about what actually happens. So direct observation, behavior analysis in the workplace. It, of course, uses unstructured data. And again, we are looking to our friends on the AI side to do things like linguistic analysis, network analysis, picking up on, again, just in plain language, the conversations that go on in the workplace that define the attitude to conduct, engagement, and culture. As part of that, the regulator is moving beyond, quite explicitly beyond, tone at the top. So whereas the senior managers regime started as quite deliberately a top-down critique of firms, we're now seeing, if you looked at the last 5 questions review, what they call tone in the middle, or messages from the engine room, I think Ted McDonald called it, motivation at the mid levels, how we get through this problem of middle managers reinterpreting rules to favor their own team interests. And finally, where we used to use, and I'm sure most of us on the panel this morning have at some point been auditors by practice, if not now, at least we have teams of auditors who report. The old style of audit was based on sampling. So you get your random number generator and look at one transaction in 100 or whatever it was. Now with the dawn of massive data processing, we can actually do 100% sampling. So the AIs and the machine, the tools that we have at the tech end are able to look at the entirety of our business transactions, whether it's the voice tapes from the dealing room for everybody for the whole year, all the clearing, all the back office fulfillment. You know, every transaction is now can be analyzed in terms of whether the behavior around the transaction is client or customer supportive or just sort of hit and run selling. Now, there's clearly a vast quantity of information behind this. And what a COO is to do? Well, we can suggest a number of things, but the first thing might be read up and keep aware of all the research that's going on behind this. A quick unashamed plug for our work at UK Finance with the Conduct and Culture Academy, of which a lot is summarized in this anthology, which is coming out next month. And you'll find that culture audit and all of those things I've just been discussing are explained in more detail. We talk about how the regulators talk to each other, how we are looking for better questions, how we're looking for qualitative assessment, and so on. This is itself the second installment in a series that started 3 years ago with the Behavioral Guide to Conduct Risk Management. So that's enough publishing my research work. Let's now look at the panel discussion, please. And if I could invite my colleagues to step up and open up, and let's just see, Lucy, you happen to be next to me on the screen here. Shall we talk about any thoughts you have on the upsides of Brexit for various financial products and markets? Any thoughts while John was speaking about market upsides there?
Well, rather than kind of market upside, I think it has given us an opportunity, as you say, to sort of think about the regulatory environment and how we respond. And so I see a lot more proactive engagement from all levels of my organization. I suspect it's the same for others as well. And a lot more positive, and to the point I think that was raised, and constructive engagement around some of these new areas of regulation, right? So the regulator really taking feedback and a sense of what certain changes actually mean for the industry and the best way of going about regulating it, and a much more sort of open and honest and transparent conversation taking place, where actually the coup organization does seem to be playing a lead role. And the types of areas I'm thinking about are obviously the migration to cloud, which brings with it all sorts of known and unknown risks and issues. The whole topic of resilience kind of more broadly. So to your point around the importance of customer outcome and being socially useful, and you know, the role and the function fundamentally that banks provide, certainly that's sort of coming up the chain a lot more. And I am observing more frequent interaction, and interaction less focused, as you say, on, you know, tell us what your metrics look like and tell us about the issue that you had, and more around, you know, strategic interaction and what that actually is going to mean in terms of customer outcomes. So whether that's Brexit related or kind of just more broadly in terms of things that were going on anyway, I'm not sure, but certainly I do see that happening in a much greater way.
I would say I agree with you, Lucy. I think that's the conduct effect more than the Brexit effect, although clearly with MiFID sort of lurking around in the background, this challenge to give better customer support is a theme of that. John, any thoughts on that? So thank you for enlightening us on the regulatory framework. Any further thoughts on sort of product outcomes from that? Perhaps how London is going to seize the baton and develop new markets, given the Brexit opportunity, if it is.
Yeah, well, I think it plays it plays to some of the points we were talking about earlier. And I think there is a clear sense that the ambition really between London and the EU is different for financial services, right? The EU has been pretty clear in the Brexit debate and subsequently that its ambition is to develop a capital market that works for the people of Europe, from a, you know, outside London relatively low capability and capacity story that they've had historically, and to reduce the autonomy, the strategic dependence of the EU on London as its financial services centre. So that's an essentially build a domestic EU market capability ambition, and that's, you know, lies behind a lot of the challenges that we'll have over the next 18 months or 2 years, working through the relationship between the UK and the EU. For financial services and the equivalence debates and all of that. The UK, though, is not, you know, as it were, the vision for the UK is not simply a European relationship one. It's a global market, and, you know, London has been the global centre for financial services for, you know, decades. If we look at these really big trends that we've already talked about, you know, they're moving very fast, and the opportunity that the UK has is to seize and create appropriate infrastructures for those, appropriate regimes for those, that facilitate the development of those markets rapidly in a way that is responsible and safe. This is not bonfire of regulation territory, as I think was on one of your slides. It's, you know, one of the key parts of the UK's international attractiveness is the fact that it has, you know, well thought through, robust regulation and supervision. But
my point on the bonfire, John, was that I don't think it has happened actually much.
No, I don't think it has. I don't think it will. I don't think it has. I don't think it will.
I think there was a kind of political trailer for that, which then sort of fizzled for various reasons. So yes,
I agree.
I think we're in furious agreement on that one.
But I think that pace, agility, you know, openness to global capital flows, more market responsive style of regulation is a massive facilitator of future opportunity for the UK in that transformed world. So that really, I think, is the story. And with that will come, you know, and as one country, clearly you can act faster than as 27. So we have to find agreement with each other. So there is a degree here of, you know, just ability to go fast and onto these new trends, and that I think is the key thing. Relationships with the US clearly also important.
Would you see that? And John, several people have raised this in roundtables I've done over the years, that the English legal system, based on case precedent and common law, is inherently more flexible than something like the Napoleonic Code, or indeed the American version of it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I would. I think that's exactly right. And and it gives. I mean, if you think about the way that you know these things have, I mean, it's almost an easy thing to say, but you know, the Europeans have sort of made rules in detail before they allow things to happen. The Americans kind of things happen and they catch up, yeah, and the UK somewhere in the middle, really, in terms of style. And I think that's not a bad place to be, because there are undoubtedly significant risks in some of these things that we're talking about here, and it's important that the legislators and the regulators have, you know, and the COOs, their business has a real eye to those, but there is also an opportunity to do some real things.
So you're describing, if I could sum up, maybe a scale from sort of permissive, you know, principles-based to prohibitive, heavily rules-based. I wonder, I noticed, Rich, you were nodding furiously during that. Rich, would you like to pick up on the perhaps the Brexit opportunity from the point of view of your own constituency?
Yeah, sure. So, look, the biggest opportunity is introducing that nimbleness in regulation. If I think back to previous role, 3 months before MiFID going live, regulation is still being written, and the complexity of trying to get that regulation decided was clearly as a result of the ecosystem that regulation was operating through, being the European jurisdiction. So that goes away now, and if the UK can introduce far greater nimbleness in its development of regulation and implementation of regulation, I think that's a huge opportunity for multiple asset classes.
And are you saying that that's an existing quality that simply needs to be tapped more, or do we need to really build, you know, work at that harder?
Well, I think we've seen some examples of where we're moving in the right direction. John mentioned the Khalifa review and the listings review. We've had the reviews, now it's about action. So how quickly can we turn some of the examples, take the, you know, Khalifa's review highlighting the fact that we need to ensure that we get the best talent into UK fintech. Well, that's clearly going to conflict with some of the views that Brexit was based upon in terms of introducing foreign talent into the UK. So how quickly can we actually turn those recommendations into reality and practically implement them? I'm a bit less bullish on that.
Can I pick up on the fintech, because this actually crosses into an area which I'm particularly interested in around conduct and the appointment of new directors. Obviously, with SMCR, we had a very heavy review of the, you know, how fit and proper were directors, how well qualified, how technically capable were they. What I observe in the industry as I go around doing my research interviews is that there's a desperate wish to bring more tech qualified people in. But there seems to be some resistance from the regulator. This may just be a perception, but I'd be interested in your view, that the regulator is resistant to bringing in people with tech skills, but without the necessary financial grounding. Do you see that as a barrier, or maybe that's a leading question? I don't know.
I think in an ideal world, the regulator would want a mixture of both, right? The experience within fintech and also the experience within financial services. But you kind of need to have lived through, my experience is tech speaks a completely different language to finance, and it's very difficult to translate between the two organizations. I've spent 2 years in a technology organization, 100% tech, not a bank that says it's a tech organization. I actually dispute that fact now that I've worked in technology for a couple of years. Banks are not fintechs. Banks are banks that use technology to facilitate the business that they operate in, but they're not technology organizations. It's a very different thing. But the two organizations,
that's a good distinction. Yes, and I mean, one of Lucy's colleagues referred to the longed for tech injection as a kind of mythical beast. You know, some tech person who's made a fortune by selling off their tech enterprise and can then be attracted into banking. And the problem is that these people don't exist, it seems to me, that somebody who's made a fortune from flogging a tech company is probably going to go on and do another tech company rather than be lured across into the banking sector. Why would you go into such a heavily regulated sector when you're used to doing your own thing?
Well, I think it depends on what we're defining finance as these days. So, you know, an example would be the chief product officer for Google recently joined Coinbase, and that's a tech company. That was a significant opportunity for them, and they're in line to make an awful lot of money as a result of that listing. What is finance now? One of the biggest growing areas is crypto. And I think this is a significant upside opportunity for the UK. Whatever you believe around crypto assets, whatever you personally think, many people that believe that there is a store there, store of value, a means of transferring assets or a means of speculation. And now that market is worth about $2.2 trillion.
So this could be the golden goose after Brexit. Chris, you've been very patient listening to us debating the joys of tech injections into the industry. Any thoughts on opening up markets after Brexit? And is that all about tech, or is there something else maybe we should be thinking about? Chris, you're muted.
So that proves my tech incompetence, and probably, but I think a lot of this is about John alluded to the regulatory playing field in the first place. So, and a lot of the discussions on the topic become very detailed very quickly. In terms of very MiFID sort of bugbears from MiFID implementation, etc. But the G20 commitments post in Pittsburgh post the financial crisis recognize the benefits of global markets. IOSCO have written a couple of papers that talk about deference, and I'm standing on a traded floor. Markets, anyone on the floor will always tell you that markets work best when they're global, and you maximize the liquidity pool. Tech can help facilitate that, but it's not the only part of the equation. I think a lot of the sort of discussions with UK authorities recently have been very constructive. But I think we need to have that as a central tenet, that we want to be a global centre, and think about all the facets that will facilitate that.
And any concerns post-Brexit of this sort of idea that we're going to become, how can I put this discreetly, too attractive to the wrong kind of business?
I think there's plenty of guards against that, and this is part of it. And John made the point again that we want somewhere that's a trusted place to do business, not where and part of that is I guess you're alluding to financial crime, but strong financial crime controls. We want the regulations in line with sort of global standards, so that nobody is concerned about doing business here.
Lucy, we were talking earlier about difference in ambition. Does that play to your understanding of that? Maybe it's about technologies and different product platforms rather than simply seizing regulatory opportunities.
Yes, I think that's probably right. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't hear a lot of debate about, regulatory opportunity seeking. I mean, it is really about competing with the right product set, with the right, and a lot of that competitive front is really around our technology base, right, and the extent to which that enables us to compete successfully. So the idea of necessarily working towards the sort of regulatory opportunity and where that may exist, to be honest, I think we probably settle on a common denominator, which tends to be the highest across all the jurisdictions that we operate in, and that's really what you're expected to sort of work towards. So regulation as competitive advantage, I think the key, I think in most instances, I think has already been said, that there's probably a view that, it works to our benefit really in terms of having those strong regulatory foundations. And I don't see a lot of that really being undermined or changed, to be honest.
Yeah, one of the things that came out of my discussions before this with the analyst team over at Reuters is that the UK tends to be much more pragmatic in applying regulation, and particularly around things like fintech, that the regulator is working with the fintechs, with the sandboxes and the kind of draft, the ideas of regulation for long enough then not to impose the regulation in a clumsy way subsequently, whereas the European approach tends to be, as we've touched on, a little more prescriptive. Anyone else like to jump in on that, sort of prescriptive versus pragmatic? John, maybe this is your pitch.
Yeah, no, just to add to that, I think that's exactly right. And you know, and I think the UK Chancellor, you know, on the back of the FinTech review, announced that, you know, the regulators would now be setting up beyond the sandbox, this, you know, this scale box, or this kind of next stage of helping
Sandbox
firms once they're established to, you know, mature a bit more with appropriate levels of regulatory attention, because there is a concern, I think, amongst the small players that they get helped getting through the authorization process, but then they kind of get the full footprint of regulation, and that just kind of suffocates them. So there is a continuing debate about how you mature a business into a full-scale business with full-scale regulation from a point that's less mature than that. And I think, you know, the authorities are rightly onto that now in the UK, and it's one of the key things potentially that could help the UK move from being, you know, a place that has innovation but not scale up to being able to do both. Which
is there a sign that our civil servants are kind of getting the message about you know, supporting enterprise more? Because I know that you're very much finger on the pulse of other jurisdictions as well. The claim was always that the UK was more kind of pro-business and business supportive in its drafting of regulation. Is that true? Is that true yet? I think, are we still kind of in the weeds trying to work out what to do next?
Well, we are definitely in the weeds, but I think that the mood music is changing definitely, and you see that in, you know, through the Treasury in particular, and through Bayes, some of the things that they're doing. So I think that is true. However, I mean, I think this comes back to some of the core parts of this session. You know, we've talked about the importance of strong regulation and that being a good thing for the UK. The issue, I think, is not so much whether the regulatory standard is too, you know, pragmatic or less pragmatic, or too strong or too weak. It's that for some of these new things, we haven't set the standard yet. We don't really know yet what the ESG standards are. There's a huge amount of work going on around it, you know, everywhere in the world. But if we want green markets to explode this year, as everybody does, if we're going to meet our net zero targets and our commitments, those standards aren't yet there in concrete. If we think about,
hold that thought, because we're going to come on to purposeful conduct and so on in just a second. But yes, I appreciate ESG is very much a big part of that. That's good. Just going to invite Chris and Rich. Any other thoughts just before we move on towards the conduct agenda? Things you'd like to wrap up on the Brexit opportunity, we can call it that. And then I'll do a quick round the panel also for action points for COOs. But Chris, any further thoughts on Brexit opportunities that I've not given you a chance to raise?
I think we've probably captured it, Roger. To me, it's about, you know, capturing London's place and making sure that we have the ability to create global businesses here, and probably as an industry moving away a little bit from some of the minor annoying things that were in MiFID or other rules that you know, are not really going to move the dial in terms of that objective.
Yeah, someone described to me MiFID as sort of uncompliable with. That's not a word, but you know what I mean. Rich, any thoughts on that or other related matters before we move on to the conduct piece?
Yeah, just one final comment in terms of, you know, the standard around a safe and secure financial system is critical. But I wonder how compatible that is with innovation and fast failing. So we've been in an environment since the 2008 crisis of zero tolerance to failure. And that's come through in particular with how conduct breaches have been penalized. Of course, we need to be flexible. Well, of course, we need a secure financial system, and that is the base. But we also need to encourage the ability to fail and to take calculated risk. And you know, my experience post that 2008, the ability to take calculated risk with hindsight perspectives kind of disappeared. You know, it disappeared a lot, and that really needs to come back in. And maybe just to add to that, tangentially, I wonder whether taking away quarterly reporting obligations might allow a longer term mindset in terms of investment that could engender a greater innovation mindset.
I think that's an excellent point from which to kind of move towards the conduct piece and the purposeful piece. I like the idea of fast fail, and I'm very keen, agreeing with you, Rich, on the point about risk. I tend to really push hard when we're doing workshops to get people to rethink the idea of risk as not being about hazard and hazard protection, but it's about the balance of opportunity and hazard. You know, risk is surely about upside as well as downside, and we tend to hear far too often in the compliance space, it's all about kind of bulletproofing everything rather than enabling business to thrive. I'm going to put you all on the spot just for sort of 30 seconds each now, so I'll give you a chance to think briefly. One thing you would say to a COO about Brexit, it may be something you've already said, or having had the discussion, you know, something you'd want to say. What's the one thing you'd say to a COO in the room with you that they need to be doing to engage with Brexit opportunity, or indeed Brexit risk? Let's do it the other way around now. So Rich, I'm going to start with you, as we were just talking. What's the one thing you want your COO friends to do here?
So when I listen to John going through all of what's happening post Brexit, it's just complex. You know, you're likely to be operating in an environment where you're not just focused on the UK, you're focused on multiple jurisdictions. And the world has just become far more complicated because you now have multiple different jurisdictions that you're trying to operate in. Regulatory reporting is changing. Rules are changing depending on where you're operating in, which customers you're dealing with, which products you're dealing with. An incredibly complex environment. And one thing I see the tech world doing differently to the finance world is embracing partnership a lot more. So who can I work with to help me solve the problems, who potentially have already done these things, or are experts in specialist areas? So, you know, the time of, many times in my career, people have said the time for building things yourself has passed, but banks still build things themselves. And maybe it's a control thing, maybe it's a nervousness around regulation, but that time really has passed with Brexit, because the world has just become doubly more complex again, and you need to embrace partnerships to solve those problems.
So get good help, get good support from people who know what they're doing.
Yeah.
Excellent point. Chris, any thoughts? If you had one thing you want your COO to take away from what we've just been talking about?
It probably depends a little bit where they're sitting. I know sort of the teams on the continent are still dealing with a shifting landscape, particularly in terms of sort of regulator expectations of the business they're doing there. But I think for the people here particularly, it's about where do we want to influence the official sector in terms of the UK's future and the direction of travel, and to move into a sort of proactive mindset. We now have that opportunity.
So engage with government actively, essentially.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and really be clear the things that move the dial that we want to put in the discussions.
Good. John, that's a rather natural segue to you, I think. So how do we engage with government better, and what else should the COO be doing?
So I was going to say exactly what Chris said, but I guess the way then thinking about how you do that, I think, is the question, and being clear that, you know, regulators come and authorities come from a more systemic angle, and the need to protect markets and protect consumers and all of those things. So making sure the dialogue is framed in the right way will help you gain that influence much more effectively than just saying, right, I'm now going to take ownership, I'm going to go marching down, you know, to a horse guards parade, whatever.
So, but getting actively involved with regulatory drafting and
yeah,
consultation
but doing
processes,
it,
all that kind of thing.
But it's doing it in recognition rather than in denial of the regulatory objectives. So accommodating, you know, what regulators are trying to achieve in terms of their market protection and consumer, and recognizing the importance of those objectives and building those into the way that you have the dialogue, rather than batting against them, because that's
excellent advice. Yes, see which direction they're going in and try and join it as far as possible. I like that. Lucy, any thoughts on those lines, or any others? So what's the one thing you'd want to say to your COO in the room?
Yeah, I mean, I would follow on with that. I would say, yes, absolutely. I think it presents a huge opportunity to the COO in terms of the engagement and the partnership that we've been talking about with regulators, in terms of helping them develop jointly the right type of regulatory environment, whether that's kind of inherent to the UK because of the pragmatic nature of how things work, or whether it's actually just a function of the necessity given kind of where we are right now, and what's required. I think that does present a huge opportunity. And I would say as well, following on from the point around risk management, I think the need for stronger risk management skills in the COO organization is never been higher, in terms of really most COOs are in a position where they're able to judge risk in a kind of a horizontal way. They see a lot in their sort of broad ranging roles. And I think being able to help the organization really understand that, size it, and work within appetite, because I do agree, I think we've kind of lost that ability to really kind of manage risk and really understand appetite and take good risk decisions. That doesn't mean we take no risk. We understand what we can mitigate and what we can manage. I think that is a key skill set which hasn't necessarily always been kind of present or required in the coup organization, but actually I think is becoming really critical.
And I think there's a bit of muddled thinking out there. I'm just going to lob into this by way of a transition into the next set of questions around the conduct agenda. I still encounter organizations that are using a metric called conduct risk appetite, which makes me rather uneasy, because it's applying kind of op risk thinking to what is really a much more behavior at risk entity. So let's move across. Thank you all for your thoughts for the COO on the Brexit opportunity. Let's now shift the focus for the next 20 minutes or so to conduct, and in particular the advent of this thing called culture assessment, which I've been completely focused on for the last year's worth of research, and we'll try not to be too dull about. But culture assessment is essentially saying that, what are people doing at the sharp end of the business? How do they understand how to put values into practice? Is there any dialogue? Is there any routine conversation around understanding that, you know, we should be bringing the best of ourselves to work, and that most people most of the time in the workplace want to do the right thing. They're a bit uncomfortable getting involved in these little conspiracies of mis-selling and bending the rules. And the regulator's thrust now is less about punitive approaches to senior or middle managers who are rule bending, and more about encouraging what we hope is the quiet majority who are doing the right thing, to show exemplary behavior in a way that's reported through the conduct reporting stream. So now that's not really a question. Let's reframe it as a question. What are the impacts of changing expectations of purpose and culture? And if I can cheekily say, what do we think about culture assessment? What do we think about the new conduct rules? I can brief us all on the 6th conduct question if that one wants to come into the mix. But essentially, it's around inviting a much more bottom-up approach, a more employee-centric approach, saying, you know, ordinary people within your firm, not the sort of masters of the universe type, the people who are doing the day-to-day customer and client service are much more closely in contact with, let's say, weak signal risk. And we need to become much more tolerant and expecting of direct input from the front line in order to be more sentient, more grounded as to social conscience, and actually more customer value building. You know, so we're not, the business model is not how many boxes can we shove out the door, but how happy can we keep customers? How genuinely well can we serve customers for their long-term interests and therefore our long-term value? So that's now enough preamble from me. Let's go, Chris. Do you feel the spirit moving you to talk on the conduct and culture situation? So this question of purpose over profit, you know, pure profit versus greater longevity through a deeper sense of social value, if I can put it like that. Is that something that you've been giving it any thought to in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously this is going to vary a little bit organization by organization, but you know, I'm lucky, or maybe, you know, lucky enough to work for a firm that I think has always valued long-term customer relationships, and therefore the value has never been exclusively about the P&L at the end of a quarter or a year. I guess what you're alluding to, Roger, a little bit in some of your preamble, though, is the difficulty of measuring that and capturing that as a kind of, you know, management view of
Indeed.
how things are working.
And in fact, if I could put that as a question for us all to think about, you know, how are we going to capture a sort of freeze report represent in any sort of way that's comparable across the industry this idea of a collective purpose, of a positive culture, of staff engagement. So the kind of indicators which I tend to see at the moment are things like training attendance at compliance sessions. Did we get 99% of the staff through their compliance obligations? You can tell from my slight cynical tone on that that's not, in my book, a particularly sound proxy indicator for a good culture or purposeful engagement. So maybe I can give you the challenge of tell me anything that you have seen or that you're working on that is better than that kind of conventional by the numbers approach. I'm sorry, Chris, you were about to say something about exactly that, I think.
I mean, to me, a lot of this, and it's not unique to this topic, we still have to use a degree of management judgment, and maybe it's slightly different in a trading type business to if you had a retail bank where staff are much more dispersed. But we do have the advantage that seniors are connected to employees a lot of the working day, and I think other more structured means, staff surveys and exchanges, but I'm not sure they're ever going to lead you to one metric or a series of metrics that are definitive. I think at best those metrics can give you questions to go and ask and things to go and think about.
Someone should really do some research and publish a research anthology on that. I can't think. John, any thoughts on the elusive metrics for good culture?
I wonder where that might come from. Well, I think that I think there's been, as you say, the kind of attendance at training is kind of doesn't tell you anything very much. You might rely on complaints and things like that in a retail space as well. Again, that tells you something, but it doesn't tell you actually whether you're inherently doing the right thing if you don't have informed interlocutors in your customer base and those sorts of things. So I think it goes to the guts of the organization, how you think about product development, how you think about services and propositions that you want to build, how you get learning from issues that do arise, and how you spread that learning across the organization. I think it's a much more embedded and inherent type of activity that will genuinely make a difference rather than just having a dashboard that will
I absolutely agree. How would you detect the presence of that learning, that kind of virtuous loop, debriefings that then feed back into better product design and better customer care, that kind of thing? Have you discovered any good mechanisms for that?
Well, I think people tend to do it either through, some people have conduct committees and things like that, but there's a sort of an escalation and there's an up and down the organization communication piece around that, that demonstrates, to say that we've changed processes, we've changed procedures, we've changed controls, whatever, to do that. There's also, explicitly, and I put quite a lot of emphasis here in the new product development processes that everybody has, or the product amendment things. Being clear that you've got the right people inputting into those, being clear that all voices are heard, and being clear that challenge is taken on board. So it's really around the transparency in that process, and then, as I say, the sort of incident response, and the learning things from those. I tend to see the most effective difference. It definitely follow through. So and learning organisations.
I'm intrigued. I'm quite intrigued by the language that you use to frame that, which is fairly sort of industry standard. It's about infractions, things going wrong. I was quite struck by Rich's point about fail fast. Move quickly, try things. And I think Lucy, I'll bounce this question to you in a second as well. The issue with the industry is a mindset that says that failure is somehow not tolerated because that's the kind of risk event that we don't like the look of. Trying a product model which doesn't work and actually potentially feeling you might have disadvantaged some customers in the process, but therefore that's some kind of infraction, compliance type event. I think we've got to move beyond that into the more kind of tech frame of let's try 3 versions of something and then develop the best one, after we've experimented with it.
I think I'm fine with that, and I agree with that. But I think you then have to explicitly consider failure as part of your development. So, if this one doesn't work, what are we going to do for that customer group? whatever it is.
I mean, I was very struck. So Alex Chesterfield, who some of you will probably know, the behavioural scientist from the FCA, who's just gone out to NatWest. She gave a very frank account when she debriefed the FCA of they were running these various, you'll probably remember, behavioural experiments around credit card provision and unauthorised overdrafts and product design and so on. And she said, we realized as we ran the first set of experiments that 3 out of the 4 first experiments were asking the wrong questions and were not really helping us to understand the problems. And I think one of the good things about behavioral science is it's a very empirical approach that says, actually, if the thing isn't working, we need to say it's not working and ask ourselves better questions, frame a better line of inquiry to make it better. Lucy, I see you're nodding. Does that resonate with your experience?
It certainly does, and we've certainly struggled and been on a journey with measuring culture, and how do you really kind of get the right kind of behaviors and questioning and critical thinking going on in the organization. So what we've done is, when we, either as a control organization or even as an audit organization, go out and assess the business, have our conversations with business, we don't just assess an issue or raise a point or an incident or an event. We talk about, and we also rate separately, and that's something that gets reported to the board, the culture in that particular organization. And that's really around, did people feel that they could raise the issue? Were they able to raise it quickly? Once it was raised, how quickly was it resolved? So we measure things like the self-identification rate of issues within a particular part of the organization. And we do this fairly, to your point, fairly granular, at a fairly granular level, because you do really need to understand what's going on, at the coalface of the organization to really make these changes.
And that just encourages what you've described is a much more grown-up measure than perhaps a lot of other firms using. Forgive me for pausing you. What a lot of firms do is look at things like whistleblowing and customer complaints. Can you explain to our audience why self-identification is a different approach from that? Because it's a much more grown-up, collective self-awareness view than just taking defensive complaints as most firms do.
Well, it's probably a factor of kind of the journey that my particular organization has been on, which has been a very fraught one in the space, right? So, we obviously measure things like, whistleblowing and all of that as well, clearly. But what this is a much more, when we're actually going through our, be it audits, when we're doing assessments, when we're working on projects, we encourage everyone to be raising not necessarily even just control issues, but issues around, a lack of investment, a lack of time to actually do something in a safe way. And it's embedded into our control framework. So we actually measure and bring to all of our relevant sort of control committees at the very lowest level of the organization. It obviously all kind of consolidates up and bubbles up to the top levels of the organization. But things like what I've spoken about around self-identification of issue, and control issue here could be, something which is kind of quite limited but may have some risk associated with it, to something which hasn't actually occurred but potentially does have quite a large, maybe even non-financial reputational risk associated with it. So not just financial risk. So this has been something which we've probably been doing this now for about 7 to 5 years, and so it's kind of constantly developing. But it is a very, very useful tool, because then you're actually not just sort of talking the talk about getting people to speak up. You're actually making it a kind of a key measure within that business. How good are people? So you're not just raising their control or operating effectiveness of their controls. You're actually talking about what is the culture around raising, resolving, rating correctly. So, do people undercook issues, or actually are they looking more thematically across their organization? So we look at things like, what percentage do they raise of limited issues versus something which might be what we call kind of more major or critical. Are they sort of consistently kind of rating things as a sort of low level issues rather than thinking about things kind of more thematically? So hard to do, because it does require a level of kind of, as you say, risk maturity and risk management competence in the organization. But I do think it has borne results in terms of having a more granular, as I say, at the coalface discussion around the control environment and what's going on the ground.
You won't be surprised here. I'm strongly in favour of that approach, and there are various conversations around that, which I know we're having at industry level as well. John, interesting question just come in, which I'll start with you and then open out to the others. Is there a sense that there's a bit of regulatory arbitrage creeping in between different conduct standards in the UK and continental Europe? So this is both a Brexit and a conduct question. I'm not sure actually even I'm familiar with this direction of travel, but any thoughts you have on that? So is there a gap opening up between the conduct approach in the UK and elsewhere in Europe? I have a couple of thoughts on that, but let's hear what you have.
I maybe put that in two frames. So firstly would be in terms of the hard letter of regulation, which is customer related or conduct related, so things like MiFID and things like that.
MiFID, yeah.
I think it is pretty clear that the UK has been, at the forefront of, we have rules, we enforce them, and we don't have rules if we're not going to enforce them. So I think that has been the case. I would slightly caveat that with, the pan-European bodies now, in particular the ECB, whose job is all about getting consistent standards and high standards across Europe, has undoubtedly led to a more robust and more detailed, probably more detailed than the UK stance on some of those, those specific bits of regulation over the past few years, and certainly people who have had to set up, or grow significant entities in Europe as a result of Brexit are feeling the full pressure of that. On culture specifically, and I'm sure, Roger, you know this better than I do, I think the Dutch have done a lot of work explicitly with
that was the point I was sitting on. I think the Dutch have actually led the charge in this.
Yeah.
So it's slightly invidious to kind of say that Europe and the UK are lagging.
No, I think that's exactly right. And in the way that the UK authorities have sort of asked questions and then drawn their own conclusions based on events and kind of other bits of supervision, but haven't really done specific supervision on culture, really. The Dutch clearly do, and that approach is now going to other countries in Europe. So we're seeing it we've seen it with clients in Germany, Ireland, France over the past 18 months or so, as that Dutch approach has got influence at the ECB and has then been used more broadly.
Yeah, I think BaFin was notably converted, possibly as following the event of Wirecard. Lucy, any thoughts? I appreciate we've had a bit on the culture assessment piece within your organisation. Any thoughts, and I don't know if it's fair even to ask this, about difference in culture assessment approaches between the UK and the European area, and this notion that our questioner has said that maybe there's a kind of arbitrage opportunity here between different jurisdictions. I'm quite struck by that. Nobody's asked me that before. It's an interesting one.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I do see a lot of interest in the kind of work that we do around kind of culture assessment. We clearly through the pandemic have been doing, I'm sure like lots of organizations, many more surveys, and kind of colleague engagement more broadly has come very much more to the forefront. And we do see a lot of interest with the regulators in looking at the results of those surveys and really kind of understanding and interrogating and, wanting to draw conclusions around what they mean. So that's certainly something that I've observed.
But is there a kind of jurisdiction differential? So I appreciate, obviously, you have a global business. Is there, a sense of the conduct agenda moving at different speeds between, say, North America, continental Europe, Far Eastern markets, and so
on? I'd say certainly in terms of the kind of conversations we have with the North American regulators and the Europe and our sort of UK regulators, quite similar in terms of the same level of interest and the same kind of lines of questioning. In Europe, probably still more of a focus around the kind of granular MI and sort of the traditional metrics, rather than, I think, a broader conversation around how employees actually feel, what that means in terms of the performance of the organization and the customer outcome, right? I'm seeing much more of a of a focus around the outcomes of some of the strategic changes, much more interrogation of some of the board level strategies, and then what does that actually mean, you know?
Yes.
And that could be, you know, cost reduction initiative, it could be, you know, new revenue generation opportunities, a lot more interest in those kind of broader strategic initiatives rather than, you know, let's just look at what your conduct dashboard said last month, right? I'm still seeing a bit more of that in the sort of European regulatory space.
So I'm slightly getting, again, slightly speaking from some commercial knowledge here. I'm doing a bit of work between the UK and France at the moment, and there's a clear sense that where the UK has really kind of got the message and the FCA is running ahead with, to take the two most obvious ones, psychological safety and cognitive diversity, both of which are appearing in this new conduct question 6. In France, not so much. I think it's fair, and they're rather following the lines, as you say, of conventional MI based on whether it's complaints or you know, satisfactory long-term product sales and customer satisfaction and that kind of thing. So there's a bit of a step change in the thinking. And the FCA, again, just to echo John's point, the FCA has consistently drawn on the Dutch tradition of research, which is about 20 years older than anybody else's, by the way, on the application of social science to regulatory design. I think the FCA doesn't always admit perhaps the debt it owes to the Dutch school on this, but the Dutch have certainly showed the way. Rich, any thoughts on the above? So a sense of, just to ask the question in its most extreme form, are we in danger of creating a sort of regulatory arbitrage trade between the UK and continental Europe in the conduct space? I'm not saying I agree with the premise of the question, by the way.
I don't really have much to add to what others have already said. But if I may, could I just come back to the point around, you know, what type of metrics could you be using to measure the collective engagement of the organization into the purpose of the company?
Certainly up for discussing that. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think, you know, some simple questions that I've seen in now other surveys from another industry is, would you recommend somebody to work in this organization? You know, I think that's a very powerful metric to understand whether people believe in the company. I'd be very interested to understand how employees use the products of the organization. So if I, given that Lucy's on the call, if I use Lucy as an example, what percentage of Barclays clients have a Barclays current account, a credit card, an ISA, a PEP, etc.? Because I'm fairly sure that could give you a sense of whether people really believe in the products and would be encouraged to improve those products.
Richard, do you mean just clients or employees as well? So people, as it were, eating their own
employees
food.
Yeah. And then the third question, the third statistic I'd be interested in is, how quickly do people sell their shares? So, you know, are they Victor Kayams? They love the company, so they bought, you know, they love the products, they bought the company, or are they looking to crystallize their deferred compensation as quickly as possible? It may not be a useful statistic for that specific organization, but I think they would be very interesting statistics for regulators to look at.
I really like that one. I think that would be a great kind of headline indicator for purposeful culture. And by the way, we haven't touched on this yet, but let me throw this into the mix. And Chris, I'm keen to bring you in on this as well. Talking about the Vox Pop question that I raised in the briefing at the beginning, there is much more now direct criticism by the public and by regulators using public spaces. So websites such as obviously Glassdoor, which we're familiar with, and it's, if we call it the TripAdvisor model of, you know, engaging with brands. I was picking up recently on a thing called Violation Tracker, which is a global record of conduct infractions, which is published as an aid to employees joining or not joining a particular branded employer. You know, would you want to work for a big employer that has a history of egregious you know, misconduct? I think there's another one out there called didtheyhelp.com, which is a website that invites the public to express their opinions, qualified by, you know, some sort of external validation, whether it's a press cutting or a letter received from a provider, to log their opinions on how the organization dealt with them during pandemic. So didtheyhelp.com is saying, how did the leader of your bank or your local MP or your branded provider of, your washing machine or whatever, or your utility providers, how did they respond to the event of you getting caught in the pandemic and maybe having, family difficulties that you needed help with or whatever? And this is just a gateway for the public to say, what's this brand's behavior on the ground? And as with all these things, a bit like Glassdoor, there's a problem of the two fat tails. You get the very happy people at one end and the very dissatisfied people at the other. But somewhere in between, you get quite a genuinely representative sample of customer experience and employee experience that is worth a look. The only reason I mention all this is that the FCA and other conduct regulators, notably Singapore, are starting to look at this kind of external, well, they've been doing it for a couple of years now, external triangulated research, which is testing, if you like, your own brand's claims to good customer care. And the regulator may now pitch up at one of these interviews with a portfolio of customer complaints which you haven't seen before because they've been externally sourced. Now that I think is quite challenging. Chris, I'm not sure if any of what I've just been saying taps into your particular sort of expert knowledge, or if you want to just respond on what we've been talking about generally on this point about arbitrage between UK and continental Europe as it's opening up.
Yeah, so to me, I mean, I think a lot of those things are probably more relevant to the retail part of the bank than they are to the wholesale. And to me, I'd probably coming back to some of the points that Lucy made earlier, that we have so few complaints that in the part of the business I'm in, that I can read each one individually, and to me it's more about the qualitative nature of what happened than it is the numbers, because the numbers are so small.
That's just showing off.
Well, I'm not sure. I think it's more about the way that trying to apply a one size fits all sort of metric to some of our organisations doesn't really work, and you have to look at different parts of the business differently.
To be fair, I'm teasing a little bit, but what a wonderful business model to be able to identify every single complaint by name and call out, what's gone wrong. Hopefully, because the underlying customer care system is so good that people don't have cause to complain in the first place. One issue I have though with complaints measurements, I know Lucy touched on this, is if you're measuring complaints or whistleblowing, it's too late. Yes, it's not a reliable proxy for customer care, because that's sort of after something's gone wrong rather than anticipating it. Is that an issue you were across?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I think we see it, the sort of customers that we have here will move their business if they're not happy with the service. And yes, I agree. The complaint certainly isn't the measure you should focus on, but it was more, an example where the qualitative nature is much more important than the end data.
You've given actually a great example of what the conduct regulator calls social license, which in plain language is people taking their business away if they don't like you. And of course, that also applies to employees. So if an employee doesn't like you, they'll simply get a job somewhere else. All right, given the market's maybe not that liquid at the moment, but in normal times, people's way of expressing their dissatisfaction is just to take their business away or to take their personal, employee support away. And the point is, they don't tell you that's what they're doing; they just do it. And I think one of the conduct challenges in this sort of culture assessment space is to look for these tacit signals, these kind of signs that all is not well with your, let's call it social engagement, looking after your staff, looking after your customers, looking after the public interest more broadly. So I wonder if we can just, in the remaining sort of 5-10 minutes, look a little bit around that and perhaps ally that with this question of cognitive diversity. So we touched on that, Richard, when we were speaking earlier about tech people. The new culture assessment is going to be particularly looking for signs that the banking sector, well, indeed finance generally, is bringing in other voices. And that's not just gender diversity, ethnicity, or other social backgrounds. It's much more broadly, how good are we at solving problems by bringing fresh thinking to the table? I think it's an incredibly positive thing that the regulator is doing with this, by the way, under cover of conduct regulation. I think it's extremely good for business value development, but I wonder if I'm alone in that thought. Any others? Lucy, perhaps I can bounce that back to you just before we do a final round. The cognitive diversity thing of bringing other voices in, maybe other industries, other experiences, how are we doing with that? What else should we do?
Well, I think, more to be done. I think, a fair amount is. I think the challenge we've sort of faced as organizations is, I think some of the programs that are being run around this, historically, I'm not sure that they've necessarily delivered the sort of outputs. I think more recently, we've seen better steps forward when you actually measure some of this and make it kind of part of a business scorecard. I mean, it's back to the old adage of what gets measured gets done, I suppose. But I don't think that's necessarily been broad enough. It's probably focused mainly on gender and really quite a big push now in terms of making sure that, if you introduce these kind of targets, you actually are getting the outcome, which is to the point, diversity of thinking. So I think it's probably more the commercial imperative around some of the challenges that we actually face as a business, which just actually require that. And making sure that happens. I do see a lot more explicit discussion around, the diversity agenda, and also kind of linked, as you say, to business outcomes rather than just something which we kind of have to do to keep, whoever happy.
There's a
I think
related
also an
question
acknowledgement.
I'm sorry. I think there's a related question of trustworthiness as well. So it's not just about the sort of business radar, your capacity to see a problem coming. It's also about building internal trust and a sense that actually anyone with talent can succeed in the organization. I think
Correct.
Partly the signaling of that, not just sort of doing diversity hirings, but showing that when you've brought people in, they have an active role and that their perspective is valued.
Absolutely. So it's not just about, the kind of a high level metric. It's actually what is your internal mobility statistic looking like? Are you actually bringing people in? And then, because that's often the issue, right? You'll kind of be relatively successful in terms of attracting the talent, but are you actually able to retain talent and get the benefit of their kind of diverse thinking? And does the organization, make space for that? And I think, that's probably something which continues to kind of be a focus. But I do see much more discussion about that in terms of actually at being a business imperative that is actually the case, and much more discussion around what is expected of successful managers, right?
Yes.
Which is precisely around not just achieving their numbers, but actually being successful developers of people, having diverse teams, being able to react quickly to issues and in a way that kind of fosters innovation and creativity. And that's obviously linked to things that we do measure, like, for example, do people feel comfortable to raise issues? Yes. And do they have is there a sense of transparency in the organizations? I think all these things need to come together.
I mean, that's an excellent suite of indicators for a COO wanting to get their arms around the new conduct agenda. And I think particularly something like internal mobility measures, such easy MI to get hold of if you ask the right question. I wonder how many firms are looking at that. And there's a bank I was working with recently who have a regretted leavers analytic. If somebody leaves who we didn't want to leave, rather than saying, why were they disloyal to us? We should ask the question, why were we disloyal to their career? We didn't try hard enough to keep them. And I think there's a kind of inversion of thinking here, which firms need to do. John, any thoughts along those lines? And I'm conscious we're getting towards the last, we're inside the last 10 minutes now. So indicators for culture assessment that you've been considering, if that's a topic that you do consider.
I do, and I mean, as a firm, we're doing a lot in the same way as all the other large organisations here, because we have the same issues, right? We have both from, as you say, from a kind of gender diversity, race diversity, and all those things. We've got work to do, and they become organisational priorities. But it is much more about how people feel comfortable in our organisation and how they can express themselves appropriately. I mean, I think all the organizations that are on this call probably will have been through an enormous amount of organizational, and very personal pain last summer after the George Floyd murder and all of those things. And those are real wake-up moments that people need to react to.
And this is, by the way, what I was referring to with Vox Pop risk, external, perfectly valid criticism. Is your organization in tune with this? One of our other questions was asking about the notion of trust within that. You know, do your employees trust you to do the right thing in response?
So I think these are massive, and I think everybody's grappling with them, and absolutely, you know, people set targets, but the targets are merely one symptom of a whole raft of underlying work that needs to be done. Really across the organisations, I think. Can I just in closing, I'm conscious you want to do that, but I do think, I mean, I just want to tie together the two bits of this conversation a bit, and add in sort of COVID actually, because, you know, in the last, we've got a situation where we've just talked about all the opportunities that are there for the industry and the industry can influence at the start. We've talked about this issue, which is an area of reputational both opportunity and threat. And the thing that ties them together, I think, is the fact that government, in particular post-COVID, is deep into financial services and in particular deep into banking. You know, it has driven a massive amount of activity over the past year. And now governments in different parts of the world will have a view as to whether and how much they want to extricate themselves from that position. But they will only be able to extricate themselves, if they do want to, if these public vox pop, parliamentary, constituency, MP letters and all of that allows the mood music and the tone to do that. So these things do come together in an important strategic way, as well as in a operating and process way. But the COOs have a key role, in my view, in enabling that.
I strongly agree with that. What I'm going to do just in the remaining 5 minutes is invite everyone just for a minute or less each to give your one takeaway point, given that we've been rambling around this now for over an hour. Thoughts for the COO. So just to briefly to encapsulate some of the things we've touched on. Brexit has shown that we have a different ambition as a UK market from continental Europe. We've seen a little bit of the extent of that ambition. COO has an opportunity to engage with that and help to shape the regulation. We've got around this question of social purpose, the idea that organizations can get a much more powerful lift from their own staff if they ask questions, if they value people's direct experiences of customer service, and if they create a more sentient way of recognizing what the risks and opportunities are from day to day at the front end of the business. So COOs, in short, who walk about, who make themselves available, who are much more directly in touch with staff, will get better returns. So if I can invite each of you to literally just in a couple of sentences, give a takeaway from the COO from this session, whether it's Brexit or purposeful culture, some combination, or indeed anything else you'd like to say. Lucy, could I invite you to give us a COO takeaway, please?
I would just say that I think the pandemic, despite all the negative that has occurred, has actually been a massive opportunity for the COO organization. I think it's really brought that role and what it can do and achieve to the fore. So I think it's something, and hopefully that won't, be eroded. We won't go back to the way things were before. So it's a broad role. It's a role that's kind of front and center. It can be a real catalyst for change. And from my kind of almost selfish perspective, I think it has a massive role to play in terms of risk management in the organization. So that would be my takeaway.
Never let a good crisis go to waste, as somebody said. Yes. John, any thoughts? Have you had to have one leave behind from all of this? If that's doable.
So I absolutely agree with that. I think it is the COOs in a key position to really enable the tone of the organisation, the style of the organisation, to drive change and drive it in the right way. And that I think people should feel very empowered about where they sit.
Thanks, John. Chris, any thoughts as we wrap up?
So I think
if you could change one thing, perhaps, what could the COO do here?
I'm not sure it's changed precisely, but we are going to go through a lot of change as an industry. We've alluded to a lot of it today. To me, the kind of central enabler for a lot of the culture is inclusivity. And as whether it's return from COVID or future ways of working, as John alluded to, the COO can help set the tone, but they can also think about the practical things that enable inclusivity and are really going to drive that agenda.
And Richard, any final thoughts just before we hand back to Maurice? What should the COO take away from this that perhaps will do differently tomorrow than they did yesterday?
So the COO is always, in my mind, seen as a safe pair of hands, somewhat the chief common sense officer. and absolutely setting the tone about what's acceptable and what's not, as has been discussed. I think an encouragement of this constrained failure or fail fast type mentality does need to come back into the industry. Otherwise, you know, who is running a business who wants the risk-free rate? Because if you take no risk, you get the risk-free rate, and that's a couple of %, right? Last time I looked,
I like that. Yes,
businesses-
no risk, no gain.
Exactly. Last time I looked, no, you know, business plans for banks are targeting double-digit returns, not 2%.
Mm. So rather, as we started the session, in fact, risk is not about downside, it's about the balance of downside and upside, or hazard versus opportunity. And hopefully, as we've seen over the last hour and a half, Brexit provides, on balance, more opportunity than hazard. Although, as John and others have said, there are quite a lot of weeds that we still have to cut our way through first. So on that vaguely optimistic note, perhaps I can hand back to Maurice to wrap us up at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you for the panel for a wonderfully enriched dialogue. Much appreciated and food for thought. Just one point I'm going to add, actually picking up from Lucy. In fact, we've got a session tomorrow, which is it's titled "The Crisis Called and the COO Answered." What lessons are learned in relation to the platform for the COO to be used for force for good moving forward? And I'm absolutely in that space that the COO has been upfront and centre and more visible. And I think the potential for the use of the platform in a broader sense has been recognised. We've also got another session within 2 hours on the COO's role in managing threat, moving from a footing of hindsight to foresight. Roger, wonderfully moderated. Thank you very much for your intellectual input and guidance throughout this conversation.
A pleasure, thank you. Great panel, by the way, you know, super input from everyone. Thank you so much.
Of course, Roger, they're COOs. What else do you expect? Thanks very much, all. Oh, and John, of course, Mr. Laver. Thank you very much, John. Thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you this afternoon or tomorrow's session.